Hello and welcome to another online lesson. Today we are exploring what is going on the home front during World War II. Remember, prior to entering this Second World War, the United States, along with much of the rest of the world, found itself in a deep depression. Today we'll see some of the things that will pull the U.S. out of their depression. So just like the First World War, we're going to see a total war effort. We'll have the soldiers fighting on the battlefield, along with civilians at home contributing to the war effort in various ways. First, the job of organizing the wartime economy fell to the War Production Board, or the WPB. They sought to meet Roosevelt's goal of making the United States the arsenal of democracy. As with the War Industries Board of World War I, the WPB's main task was to manage the conversion of industries to military production. Automobile companies switched from making car engines to airplane and tank engines. Those sort of transitions seem natural, but others not necessarily. For example, a soft drink company might retool its machinery and retrain its workers to pack artillery shells with explosives. A maker of model trains would begin producing bomb fuses. All across the country, businesses mobilized their resources to serve the needs of the military, and millions of unemployed workers would be put to work in a wartime production boom. So as these factories ramped up production, they needed workers. The demand for workers skyrocketed during the war. As men left their jobs to serve in the armed forces, industry hired unemployed men to fill those jobs. But as war production soared, businesses and the government started recruiting women using slogans such as, "The more women at work, the sooner we win." About 18 million women took jobs outside the home during the war. That's up from 12 million before the war. The government used characters such as Rosie the Riveter to recruit women to take on jobs. Over 2 million women worked in shipyards and other heavy industries such as riveting. This would eventually lead to the feminist movement of the 1960s. And that's something that can be seen in this quote. The war years had a tremendous impact on women. I know for myself it was the first time I had a chance to get out of the kitchen and work in industry and make a few bucks. You came out to California, put on your pants, and took your lunch pail to a man's job. This was the beginning of women's feeling that they could do something more. This comes from Sybil Lewis, as quoted in The Homefront, America During World War II, published in 1984. Remember, the United States was fighting in the name of democracy against Nazi Germany, which embraced an extreme form of racism based on the idea of Aryan supremacy. But racism was still a powerful force in American society. No one was more keenly aware of this contradiction than African Americans. After all, their participation in World War I had not helped their struggle against racism at home. As one black newspaper, the Chicago Defender, asked, "Why die for democracy for some foreign country when we don't even have it here?" But African Americans started to see advances during the Second World War. They were able to serve in segregated units, mostly in support roles, later on in combat positions. You'd see the Second Great Migration as African Americans came up north to work in factories. And they embraced a double V, or double victory campaign, which meant a victory for democracy both at home and abroad. And this would lead directly to the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 1960s. So the typical American family contributed to the war effort by doing such things as planting victory gardens and bringing scraps to scrap drives. A lot of kids would be seen bringing old bicycles or tires to these drives. These were materials that were vital to the war effort that were collected during these drives. Americans would also experience rationing during the Second World War. They would have to accept this system for limiting the distribution of food, gasoline, and other goods, so the military could have the weapons, equipment, and supplies it needed. As a result, life in the United States would change dramatically. People were given stamps or coupons that controlled the amount of goods that were being sold to different families. Blue coupons controlled processed foods such as canned goods. Red coupons controlled meats, fats, and oils. These changes were evident in many ways, even in clothing styles. The armed forces needed fabric for uniforms. In March of 1942, the government announced rules aimed at saving more than 40 million pounds of wool a year. Men's suits could no longer be sold with a vest or an extra pair of pants. Cuffs were eliminated, as were patch pockets and wide lapels. The new rules also restricted the type and amount of fabric in women's clothes. Designers cooperated by using more synthetics, such as rayon, and by making skirts shorter and dresses simpler. And as they had been asked to do in World War I, Americans were also asked to buy war bonds. When Americans bought war bonds, they were loaning money to the government. In exchange, the government promised that bonds could be cashed in at some future date for the purchase price plus interest. This was all in an effort to raise money for the war. And a common theme that we've seen throughout our study of U.S. history and wars this year is the restricting of civil liberties during wartime. Remember, during the Civil War, Abraham Lincoln suspends the writ to habeas corpus. During the First World War, we see restrictions on freedom of speech in the First Amendment. And the Second World War will be no different, because Americans were concerned over a Japanese invasion of the West Coast. Remember, that's primarily where many Japanese Americans lived, is on the West Coast, because they're arriving via the Pacific Ocean. So Franklin Delano Roosevelt will declare an Executive Order 9066. And what will happen is 110,000 Japanese Americans will be placed in internment camps along the West Coast. This act ordered, or the act order applied to both citizens and non-citizens of Japanese origins. So 110,000 people are taken from their homes and put in these camps until the war ends. Just like we saw in the First World War with Schenck versus the U.S. trying to argue against those restrictions on the First Amendment, we'll see another Supreme Court case going against the Executive Order 9066 in Korematsu versus the United States in 1944. See, Fred Korematsu argued that internment of Japanese Americans was a violation of their constitutional rights, as many of them were American citizens. But the Supreme Court ruled that the safety of the nation was more important than the constitutional rights of individuals. Korematsu versus U.S. continued the idea started in Schenck that individual rights can be temporarily eliminated during wartime. This will remain a blunder on the record of the United States for decades to come. We'll talk about Korematsu versus the U.S. a lot more in class as we explore this idea of restricting civil liberties during wartime when we compare it to the Patriot Act of the 2000s. So that's all for today in the home front during World War II. Next time, we'll explore what's going on in the battlefields and winning the war.